It began with a photograph, one no family meant for strangers to ever see. It was found tucked inside a cedar chest, the wood warped and swollen from years of damp, hidden beneath quilts that crumbled at the touch. When the chest cracked open, it exhaled the smell of mold and moth dust, as though the very air inside had been trapped for decades. And there, lying in silence, was the picture. The image was faded, its corners curling, its ink bleeding into shadow. At first, nothing seemed unusual. A woman sat rigid, her hands folded, her face severe but steady. Beside her was a man, close in age, and yet his features felt disturbingly familiar. His jawline echoed hers, his eyes mirrored hers. Their resemblance was so striking, it blurred the line between husband and brother. Staring too long at their faces stirred a kind of unease, as if the portrait itself knew it was hiding a forbidden truth. Pinned to the back of the frame was a name. Only one name, not two. Not husband and wife, not mother and father, just a single name that belonged to the woman herself. It was as if the man beside her didn't matter. Or perhaps it was as if naming him would betray the secret the Ridge people tried to bury. They say she married her half-brother, that she stood before a preacher, not as a bride, but as a daughter binding blood to blood. Some whisper she did it out of love. Others insist it was to keep land, inheritance, or power locked inside her family name. But whatever the reason, the consequences stained the soil of that ridge for generations. Children born too frail, too silent, or too strange for neighbors to look upon without unease. In towns like these, silence becomes the strongest voice. Elders kept her memory low, her story told only in fragments, whispered across porches or muttered in churchyards. But silence cannot stop the weight of a truth this heavy. It seeps into the ground, into the cabins, into the stones carved with names that repeat again and again. And so the question remains, sharp as broken glass. Who was this woman, this matriarch, who turned her half-brother into her husband? And why do her descendants still cast a shadow over the ridge today? The ridge where her name was first spoken aloud sits buried deep in the Appalachian spine, where the mountains fold in on themselves like clenched fists. Outsiders rarely came, and those who did never stayed long. The roads narrowed into dirt paths, the kind where wheels sank into clay and horses strained against the climb. The trees pressed close, their branches knitting together overhead until daylight itself seemed to dim. The ridge was its own world, sealed off from the rest of the country, a world where families lived and died without ever stepping beyond the mountains that hemmed them in. The town itself was little more than a scattering of cabins. Their roofs sagged, their boards bleached grey by decades of rain. Chickens scratched in the dust between them, and smoke rose from stone chimneys in thin, hungry lines. There was one church, leaning slightly to the left, its bell cracked and useless. The church doubled as the schoolhouse, though children often disappeared from the benches before the preacher could finish his lesson. Some left because their families needed them on the land. Others vanished for reasons never spoken, their absence explained with a silence heavier than words. Isolation shaped these people. They grew suspicious of outsiders and wary even of one another. Bloodlines folded inward, names repeated on every gravestone, faces reappearing generation after generation. It was not unusual for cousins to marry, nor for kin to live in clusters so close that family ties blurred. But whispers said that this matriarch, this woman whose name lived longer than her own flesh, had crossed even further into forbidden ground. Her half-brother was no stranger to her. He had grown up in the same cabin, eaten from the same pot, slept beneath the same leaking roof. Their bond was not just familial, it was survival, in a place where the outside world offered nothing. Perhaps the temptation to bind blood with blood felt less like a sin and more like inevitability. Still, the ridge remembered. It remembered through rumor, through sidelong glances, through the way her name was always spoken lower than any other. In a town where every soul knew their neighbor's business, the silence surrounding her marriage was more telling than any confession. What drove her to make that choice? Was it love, desperation, or something darker? The truth was hidden, but the consequences, those were carved into the ridge like scars. Every story begins as a whisper, and hers was no different. On summer nights, when the fireflies drifted low over the grass and the air grew heavy with heat, the older women would sit on their porches, fanning themselves with folded papers, their voices just loud enough to be heard by whoever lingered close. They spoke of her children, of the way some of them never seemed to meet another's eyes, of how their words came out slow and tangled, as if language itself resisted their mouths. To some, it was just the mark of poverty and isolation, but to others, it was a punishment. Blood was not meant to fold in on itself. The preacher never named her from the pulpit. He didn't have to. The scripture was clear, its warnings etched in black and white. Flesh of your flesh was not meant to become your spouse. Still, her cabin filled with children, each one a reminder of vows that should never have been spoken. One piece of evidence emerged, fragile and nearly forgotten. A letter tucked between the pages of an old hymn book, its edges torn, its words jagged and uneven, as though written in a shaking hand. Her blood will not mix clean, it read. They've bound what was meant to stay apart. The letter was unsigned. Some said the deacons burned it before the next Sunday, feeding it to the stove flames to keep the secret buried. Others swore it still exists, hidden in the rafters of the church, waiting for someone bold enough to reach up and take it down. But perhaps the strongest proof lay in the earth itself. Behind the church, where weeds grew waist-high, the graveyard spread across the slope. Stone after stone bore the same surname, repeating until the words blurred together. Small graves, heartbreakingly small, marked with nothing more than infant or a first name carved by trembling hands. Too many children for one family alone, too much sorrow to be dismissed as coincide. Neighbors said some of those babies were never carried into the church for baptism, that they were buried quietly before dawn when no one was meant to see. Whether the whispers were true or not, the silence surrounding them became its own kind of evidence. And at the center of it all stood the matriarch, her lips sealed, her back unbroken, her gaze daring anyone to speak what they feared. But silence has a way of cracking, and once it does, the truth seeps out. Over time, the line between truth and legend blurred until no one could separate them. Some swore the matriarch had been cursed from the day she was born, that her mother dreamed of black birds circling the cabin roof before the child ever drew breath. Others claimed she carried a mark on her skin, something hidden, something only her kin knew of, proof that her bloodline had been twisted before her own marriage ever took place. The stories about her eyes never faded. They weren't remarkable in color or shape, but people remembered the way they seemed to linger too long. Hunters said that when she looked their way, the woods went silent, no birdsong, no rustle of leaves, as though the ridge itself held its breath. Children, daring one another to run past her cabin, whispered that they could feel her gaze even when the shutters were nailed closed. Was it superstition, or had she become, in the minds of the ridge folk, something more than human, an omen wrapped in the shape of a woman? But when the stories turned to fact, they were harder to dismiss. Entire years of county records vanished, births left unregistered, deaths left without explanation. The clerk who served in those years admitted in old age that pages had been pulled from the books, not lost, but deliberately removed. By whom, he never said. So the town did what towns like these always do. They filled the silence with their own tales. They whispered that her children were locked away in the attic, kept from view. They swore that in the deep of winter, when the snow pressed heavy on the eaves, they heard lullabies drifting from her cabin, songs meant for little ones who would never see the daylight. And they claimed that on certain nights, candles burned behind her windows long after midnight, shadows moving across the panes that did not belong to her alone. And yet, in the daylight, she seemed ordinary. He walked the dirt road, traded eggs for flour, bowed her head during hymns like anyone else. To see her in passing was to wonder if the whispers were lies. But what if they weren't? What if every story, every superstition, every shadow whispered on the ridge was a memory the townspeople could not face aloud? Sometimes folklore is not invention at all. Sometimes it is the only way a community knows how to remember. Generation after generation, the same curse seemed to repeat. Children born too early, too fragile to last the winter, infants whose bodies carried marks that no doctor ever explained. Some grew older, but never quite right. Spines twisted, eyes misaligned, voices uneven, as if their very bones remembered the forbidden vow their mother had spoken. In the minds of the ridge folk, these were not accidents of nature. They were punishment, proof carved into flesh that blood should not have folded back onto itself. The land itself seemed to carry the weight of it. Neighbors claimed her crops withered sooner than anyone else's. Milk soured in her pails while the same morning's yield stayed sweet across the road. Some nights the wind carried her cries, not of grief, but of rage, calling out against God for what he had taken from her. Others said they heard lullabies instead, soft songs rising from her cabin long after the babies were buried, sung to no one who lived. Her family name became something whispered, never spoken loud. Teachers in the one-room schoolhouse noted the surname again and again. Children who struggled to learn their letters, children who slipped away from class until their desks sat empty. In the churchyard, their graves multiplied, repeating the same carved names as if time itself were stuck in a loop. And still, the bloodline endured. Despite shame, despite whispers, despite death itself, the matriarch made certain her family carried on. There were those who swore she demanded it, that she ordered her children to bind themselves to their own kin, just as she had done. Each new generation tightening the knot, the curse passed down by choice as much as by blood. The stories grew darker, of a daughter who carried her father's child, hidden until both mother and infant were gone, their names erased before they could be recorded. Were these stories born of fact or of fear? On the ridge there was little difference. What cannot be denied is this: the suffering repeated, over and over, as if the family had been chained to a wheel that never stopped turning. And if you're still watching now, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this had been your bloodline? But the question remains, did the curse ever truly end? Or does it still live, silent and unseen in the descendants who remain? The past does not always speak in words. More often it lingers in objects, mute, unyielding, but louder than any confession. On that ridge, the truth of the matriarch's family survives not in written records, but in fragments left behind like bones buried shallow. Her cabin still stands, though the mountains are trying to take it back. The roof has caved in, vines twist through the beams, and the porch sags as if the earth itself is swallowing it whole. Step inside and the air is heavy with mold, cedar, and silence. In one corner, scratched into the wall, the family surname repeats again and again, carved by different hands across the decades, each generation leaving its mark, as if to remind the world, or perhaps themselves, that they existed, no matter the shame that surrounded them. Beneath the warped floorboards, a Bible was once found, its cover cracked, its pages swollen with damp. Certain verses were marked again and again in thick, trembling strokes, passages of sin, flesh, punishment, and curses visited upon children for the sins of their parents. Between the pages were scraps of paper, lists of names, some crossed out with heavy lines, as if someone tried to erase them from memory. Photographs surface, passed quietly from hand to hand. In one, the matriarch stands rigid beside her half-brother, their faces eerily similar, their expressions unreadable. In another, a cluster of children stares into the lens with vacant eyes, their features blurred between familiar and unsettling. These images feel less like family keepsakes and more like evidence, each one a fragment of a truth that no one dared to speak aloud. And then there are the stones. The churchyard is crowded with them, a field of repetition. The same surname carved over and over, infants buried before their names could be written, rows of children who never reached a second birthday. To walk among whose graves is to hear a silence louder than any scream. These artifacts are fragments, but together they form a story too heavy to dismiss. A Bible marked in desperation, photographs that seem to accuse, stones that refuse to let the ground forget. But one question lingers, colder than the rest. Were these things left behind by accident, or did someone, somewhere in the family, want the truth to be uncovered one day? It always begins the same way, with a discovery, a photograph, a Bible, a name whispered by accident, but it never ends cleanly because the truth refuses to stay buried. The ridge may have grown quiet, its cabins rotting back into the soil, but the story of the matriarch lingers like a shadow stretched too long. She is remembered not only for what she did, but for what she set in motion. One vow spoken in defiance of law, faith, and bloodline bound her descendants to a legacy they could never escape. Generation after generation carried that weight, their lives shaped not by choice, but by the echo of hers. A single decision, repeating itself across decades, written into faces, carved into gravestones, carried forward whether they willed it or not. The people who lived nearby learned not to speak of her name. Outsiders forgot her entirely, but history does not vanish. It waits, and every so often her memory rises again, pulled from the earth like a relic no one meant to disturb. An old photograph found in an attic trunk, a gravestone stumbled upon in the weeds, a surname encountered in a place it should not be. Each discovery is like a hand reaching out from the past, reminding us that silence does not mean absence. Perhaps that is the truest curse. Not deformities, not whispers of madness or stillborn children, but the knowledge that the past never truly leaves. That shame, once planted, can outlive flesh and stone alike. And so we return to the beginning, to the cracked Bible, the carved names, the brittle photograph. Were these things hidden, or were they left as warnings? Did the matriarch mean for her story to disappear, or did some part of her want it told? No one can say for certain. The records are incomplete, the testimonies unreliable, the graves worn smooth by time. And yet, the silence speaks. It tells us that somewhere out there, her bloodline may still be walking among us, changed by centuries perhaps, but carrying in their veins the echo of a choice that should never have been made. So when you pass through the ridges of Appalachia and you find yourself near an abandoned cabin, a forgotten graveyard, or a name that feels heavier than the rest, ask yourself, are you certain her story has ended? Or could the matriarch's vow still live on, waiting in the dark for someone to notice?